Imagine being surrounded by luxury, but one wrong assumption turns your night into a life-threatening game of lies and betrayal. What if the person you trusted most was the one hiding the darkest secret, and someone wasn't going to make it out alive? Stay with me as we unravel the chilling truth that no one saw coming. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the grand facade of the hotel. Its tall glass windows reflected the bustling city lights, giving it an aura of prestige and luxury. A sleek black car rolled up to the entrance, its polished surface gleaming under the streetlights. The valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, stepped forward, but paused as the door opened. Out stepped James Williamson, a tall, distinguished man with salt and pepper hair dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. His wife, Marcia, followed, her poise unmistakable in her simple yet elegant dress that seemed to radiate understated sophistication. The valet's hesitation didn't go unnoticed by the couple. He gave them a brief, almost skeptical glance before offering a half-hearted greeting. James handed over the keys with a polite smile, while Marcia adjusted her scarf, her expression calm but watchful. The valet murmured something about parking being tight, though the lot behind him told a different story. Without complaint, James gestured for Marcia to proceed, and together they entered the revolving doors of the hotel. Inside, the atmosphere was abuzz with wealth and elegance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, and the faint hum of conversations blended with the gentle tinkling of piano keys from a corner. The reception desk stood at the center, a beacon of opulence. Behind it, Carol, a sharp-featured woman in her late 30s, manned the station. Her professional smile faltered for a split second when she saw them approach. "Good evening," James said, his tone warm but firm. "We have a reservation under Williamson." Carol tapped away at her computer, her manicured nails clicking loudly in the otherwise quiet interaction. After a moment, she frowned slightly and shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see a reservation under that name." Her eyes darted over the couple, her tone polite but laced with doubt. "Are you sure it's for this location?" Marcia exchanged a look with James, a quiet exchange that spoke volumes. "Yes, we're sure," Marcia replied evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "Could you check again, please?" Carol sighed as though they were inconveniencing her. She typed for another few seconds, then gave an apologetic shrug. "I'm afraid we don't have anything. And, unfortunately, we're fully booked tonight." Her words were carefully chosen, but her demeanor betrayed her indifference. Just as she finished speaking, another couple walked up to the desk, a middle-aged white man in a business suit and his elegantly dressed wife. Carol's demeanor shifted instantly. Her smile brightened, and her voice softened as she greeted them warmly. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Hollingsworth, your suite is ready. Welcome back." James and Marcia stepped aside, their presence seemingly forgotten. Marcia's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile as she folded her arms. "It seems they have room for some," she murmured under her breath. James gave a soft chuckle, his eyes scanning the lobby. "Let's see how far this goes," he replied quietly. The Hollingsworths were ushered to their suite with the kind of hospitality one would expect from a place of such stature. Meanwhile, James and Marcia stood near the entrance, ignored by passing staff. Marcia noticed the way a bellhop glanced their way, whispering something to a colleague. She could sense the judgment, the assumptions being made. "It's fine," James said, his voice calm and steady. "We have time." But behind his composed exterior, something flickered in his eyes, something Carol and the others failed to notice. Marcia saw it, though. She had seen it before. It was the quiet determination of a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. And so they waited. For now. The minutes stretched on as James and Marcia remained standing near the entrance of the lobby. Staff members bustled around them, their movements precise and purposeful, but their glances told a different story. A few whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the couple before quickly looking away. James noticed but didn't react, his posture relaxed, hands resting in his pockets. Marcia, however, felt the tension rising in her chest. "Excuse me," she said finally, approaching the desk again. Her tone was polite but firm. "Can you please double-check? This is not a mistake on our end." Carol looked up, her lips tightening into a forced smile. "Ma'am, as I mentioned earlier, we are fully booked tonight. I've already checked twice." Her voice carried a hint of irritation now, as though Marcia's persistence was unreasonable. Marcia studied her for a moment, her calm demeanor unshaken. "And yet," she said slowly, her eyes flickering toward the elevators, "I've seen at least 2 other parties check in while we've been standing here." Carol stiffened, clearly caught off guard. Before she could respond, the doors of the hotel swung open again, and a man with a booming voice entered the room. "Donovan," he called to the staff, tossing his keys to the valet without sparing a glance. Mr. Donovan, a wealthy regular at the hotel, strode in like he owned the place. His tailored suit and overly loud mannerisms screamed self-importance. He paused mid-step when his eyes landed on James and Marcia, standing quietly by the desk. For a moment, his lips curled into a smirk. "Didn't know they were letting just anyone in here these days," he muttered, loud enough for them to hear. James ignored the comment, but Marcia's jaw tightened. Carol, clearly flustered, hurried to greet Mr. Donovan, her tone instantly warmer and more accommodating. "Welcome back, Mr. Donovan. Your usual suite is ready." Donovan waved her off. "Of course it is. Let's keep it that way." He gave James and Marcia one last look before heading toward the elevator, his smirk lingering like a bad stench. Marcia stepped back to James, her voice low but sharp. "How much longer are we going to let this happen?" "Patience," James replied, his voice calm. He leaned slightly toward her, his expression unreadable. "Let them keep showing their true colors." As the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that the couple had been deliberately sidelined. A younger staff member, Anna, watched the entire situation unfold from behind the concierge desk. She bit her lip, her unease growing with every passing moment. It wasn't the first time she had seen guests treated unfairly, but this felt worse. The couple's quiet dignity only made the staff's behavior more glaring. Anna hesitated, glancing toward Carol, who was busy laughing at something Mr. Donovan had said earlier. After a moment's pause, Anna approached the couple cautiously. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice soft and nervous. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how you're being treated. This isn't right." Marcia smiled warmly at her, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle but appreciative. "It takes courage to say that." Anna looked down, fidgeting with the edge of her name tag. "If there's anything I can do to help." James shook his head, his expression kind but firm. "Not yet," he said quietly. "But we'll remember this." Anna nodded, stepping away just as Carol returned to the desk. Carol shot her a suspicious glance before turning her attention back to James and Marcia. "Is there something else I can help you with?" she asked, her tone clipped. James met her gaze evenly. "No," he said simply. "We're fine waiting." But the way he said it, calm yet commanding, made Carol falter for a split second. She recovered quickly, plastering on her fake smile, but something about his presence was starting to unnerve her. As the couple settled into a corner of the lobby, unnoticed by most of the staff, James's phone buzzed. He checked the screen briefly before showing it to Marcia. She glanced at the message and nodded. "It's almost time," she said softly, her lips curving into a faint smile. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. "Let's see how far they take this," he murmured. The air around them shifted. Something unspoken lingered in their silence, something the rest of the hotel staff failed to notice. For now. The hotel lobby grew busier as evening deepened. Guests strolled in, their laughter and chatter echoing against the high ceilings. Staff bustled around with polished smiles, attentive to every need, but not James and Marcia. The couple remained seated near the corner of the room, a quiet yet striking presence amidst the luxury. Carol continued her work at the reception desk, sneaking glances at them every now and then. Her unease had grown since her earlier interactions. She couldn't quite place it, but something about James's composed demeanor unsettled her. It wasn't defiance, it was confidence. Mr. Donovan reappeared, his heavy footsteps stomping toward the bar. He glanced at the couple again and snorted. "Still here?" he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. He waved over a bartender, ordering an expensive drink with a smug grin. Marcia's patience was wearing thin. She leaned closer to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's becoming unbearable. Do you think he does this to everyone?" James tilted his head slightly, his gaze following Donovan as the man slouched into a bar stool. "Not everyone," he said, "just the ones who make him feel small." Across the room, Anna couldn't keep her eyes off the couple. She had been at the hotel for over a year and had grown used to the subtle unfairness that sometimes lingered in the air, but this felt different. It was deliberate, calculated. She clenched her fists as she watched Carol chatting easily with Donovan, her earlier smugness replaced by an obsequious charm. Finally, Anna made a decision. She grabbed a glass of water and approached the couple, her hands trembling slightly. She placed a glass on the small table in front of them, her voice quiet. "Here, just something while you wait." Marcia looked up at her, a soft smile spreading across her lips. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind." Anna hesitated, then whispered, "I don't think they'll do the right thing. If they don't, please, just tell me how I can help." James gave her a long, measured look. "You've done enough already," he said, his voice calm but appreciative. "Kindness doesn't go unnoticed." Anna nodded and quickly walked away, her heart pounding. She felt a pang of guilt for not doing more, but the quiet strength in James's words stayed with her. Meanwhile, at the bar, Donovan was becoming louder. He called over the bartender again, this time complaining about the service. "You know," he said, gesturing toward James and Marcia, "this place used to have standards. Now look at what walks through the door." The bartender, clearly uncomfortable, tried to defuse the situation, but Donovan wouldn't let it go. "Probably trying to sneak in," he added, laughing at his own joke. Marcia's hand tightened around her scarf. She wanted to respond, but James placed a steady hand on her knee, shaking his head slightly. "Let him dig his hole," he said quietly. As the clock ticked on, the tension in the room became almost palpable. Donovan continued to drink, his voice growing louder with each passing moment. Staff members avoided the bar, unwilling to deal with his behavior, but his comments about the couple carried across the room. Finally, Carol clearly irritated by the scene Donovan was causing, approached the bar. "Mr. Donovan," she said in a low voice, "perhaps it's time to retire to your suite for the evening." Donovan waved her off. "Relax, Carol. I'm just having a little fun." His eyes darted toward James and Marcia again, his smirk widening. "They don't seem to mind, do they?" Marcia's eyes narrowed, but James remained unmoved, his expression unreadable. Carol, desperate to maintain control, leaned in closer to Donovan, whispering something to him. Whatever she said, it made Donovan pause for a moment. He glanced at her, his smirk faltering, before nodding begrudgingly and leaving the bar. As Donovan disappeared into the elevator, Carol turned back toward the desk, her expression tight. Something about her seemed different now, less confident, almost wary. Marcia noticed it too. She leaned toward James, her voice barely audible. "She's hiding something," she said. James's gaze followed Carol as she retreated to her station. "They all are," he replied, his tone even. "And it's starting to unravel." The room seemed to settle, the tension easing as Donovan's presence faded. But an undercurrent of unease lingered. Marcia sipped her water, her eyes scanning the lobby. "It's not just him," she said quietly. "There's something else going on here." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp and focused. "We'll find out soon enough," he said. And with those words, the night began to take an even darker turn. The elevator doors closed with a quiet hum, taking Donovan to the top floor where his suite awaited. The lobby settled into an uneasy calm, the faint murmurs of conversation blending with the gentle clink of glassware from the bar. James and Marcia remained seated, their patience unshaken, though Marcia's sharp eyes followed every movement of the staff. Carol returned to the reception desk, her expression tight and distracted. She avoided looking at the couple, focusing instead on rearranging the neatly stacked papers in front of her. But her hands trembled slightly, betraying the growing anxiety she was trying to hide. Across the room, Anna observed her. Something wasn't right. Carol's confident facade had begun to crack since her whispered exchange with Donovan. Anna's unease deepened. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more happening than what met the eye. The stillness of the lobby was broken by the faint ding of the elevator returning to the ground floor. A bellhop stepped out, his face pale and eyes wide. He hesitated, scanning the room before rushing over to Carol. "Miss Carol," he whispered urgently, leaning close to her. There's something wrong in Mr. Donovan's suite." Carol's head snapped up, her face draining of color. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice a sharp whisper. I don't know how to say it," the bellhop stammered. He's not moving, and there's blood everywhere." Carol froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she didn't move, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, composing herself, she straightened and gestured toward the staff phone. "Call security. Now," she ordered, her voice clipped but shaking. The bellhop rushed off, leaving Carol standing rigidly behind the desk. Her carefully curated professionalism had all but vanished, replaced by a visible layer of panic. She stole a glance at James and Marcia, who were watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. "What do you think that's about?" Marcia asked softly, leaning toward James. "Something serious," James replied, his gaze steady. "Let's wait and see." A few minutes later, two security guards rushed across the lobby and disappeared into the elevator. Carol followed closely behind, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The other staff whispered among themselves, their nervous energy palpable. Anna moved closer to James and Marcia, unable to stop herself. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I've never seen Carol like that before." "Whatever it is," James said, "it's going to bring everything to light." The elevator returned, and Carol emerged, her face pale and her movements stiff. She made a beeline for the front desk phone and called the police. Her voice, though low, carried through the hushed lobby. "Yes, this is Carol Masters at the Grand Royal Hotel," she said. "We have an emergency. A guest has been found dead in his suite. Please send someone immediately." A ripple of shock spread through the staff as her words registered. Marcia raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Dead?" she whispered to James. "Things just got interesting," James murmured, leaning back in his seat. The lobby descended into a tense silence. Guests began to notice the commotion, and the whispers grew louder. Staff tried to maintain their composure, but their faces betrayed their unease. Within moments, the sound of police sirens pierced the air outside, and 2 officers entered the lobby. Carol greeted them, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. The officers nodded and made their way to the elevator, escorted by the security guards. James and Marcia exchanged a look. They could feel the atmosphere shifting. The tension that had been simmering all evening was beginning to boil over. "This," Marcia said quietly, "is about to get much bigger than anyone expected." James nodded, his expression calm but thoughtful. "And we're right in the middle of it." The tension in the lobby thickened as the police officers returned from the top floor. Their faces were grim, and they spoke in hushed tones with Carol and the head of hotel security. Guests started murmuring louder, the news of a death traveling through the grand space like wildfire. Despite the growing unrest, James and Marcia remained seated, their expressions unreadable as they quietly observed the scene. Carol's earlier composure had completely unraveled. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice wavered as she recounted what little she knew. I didn't notice anything unusual," she stammered, her hands nervously clutching a pen. "He was fine when he went up earlier." One of the officers, a tall man with a firm yet calm demeanor, glanced around the room. His eyes lingered on James and Marcia for a fraction of a second before turning back to Carol. "We'll need to speak with everyone who had contact with Mr. Donovan today," he said. Carol nodded stiffly, but her gaze darted toward James and Marcia. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer to the officer. There's a couple," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They've been here for hours. They didn't have a reservation, but they insisted they did. I don't know. Maybe they—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The officer's brow furrowed as he followed her gaze. Slowly, he approached James and Marcia, who remained seated, calm and composed. "Good evening," he said, his voice professional but firm. "I'm Officer Ramirez. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" James gestured toward the empty seat across from them. "Not at all, officer. Please, have a seat." Officer Ramirez hesitated, clearly surprised by James's composure. He pulled out a small notepad and sat down. "Can I have your names, please?" "James Williamson," James said. "This is my wife, Marcia." "And what brings you to the Grand Royal Hotel tonight?" Ramirez asked, his pen poised over the notepad. "We had a reservation," Marcia replied, her tone calm but with an edge, "though the staff here seems to think otherwise." Ramirez glanced at Carol, who was watching from a distance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. He turned back to the couple. "Did you have any contact with Mr. Donovan this evening?" "We saw him," James said, leaning back slightly. "He made quite a spectacle in the lobby and at the bar. I'm sure plenty of others noticed him, too." "And did you speak to him?" "No," James replied, his voice steady. He seemed preoccupied with other things. Ramirez studied them for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where have you been for the last hour?" "Right here," Marcia answered smoothly. "Feel free to check the cameras. We haven't moved." Ramirez jotted something down in his notebook, then nodded. "We'll be doing just that. Thank you for your cooperation." As he stood to leave, Marcia leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but pointed. "Officer, I hope you'll look closely at the people who interacted with Mr. Donovan directly. There's a lot happening here that doesn't meet the eye." Ramirez paused, meeting her gaze. There was something about her tone, something unspoken but deliberate. He nodded curtly and walked away, joining the other officers near the elevators. Marcia leaned back, exhaling softly. "She's trying to deflect," she said, her eyes flicking toward Carol. "She's desperate," James agreed. "And desperation makes people sloppy." Across the lobby, Anna watched the exchange nervously. She wanted to speak up, to defend the couple, but fear held her back. She could see how Carol's gaze darted between the officers and James and Marcia, the wheels turning in her mind. As the investigation continued, the atmosphere in the hotel grew heavier. Guests whispered in clusters, speculating wildly about the murder. Staff hurried about, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but their strained expressions betrayed their unease. Marcia turned to James, her voice low. "This isn't just about him," she said. "Something else is happening here. You can feel it." James nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the officers questioning staff members. "We're getting closer to the truth," he said. "Let's see how much longer they can keep up the act." The evening stretched on, and the sense of unease deepened. The couple remained patient, their quiet observation contrasting sharply with the growing chaos around them. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, it was clear that the murder had shaken the hotel to its core, and the real story was just beginning to unravel. The police presence grew more pronounced as the investigation expanded. Officers moved methodically through the lobby, speaking with staff and guests, their notepads filling with details that painted an increasingly fragmented picture of what had happened. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward James and Marcia, as if their quiet composure only added to the mystery. Carol stayed close to the reception desk, her face growing paler with every passing moment. She avoided direct eye contact with the couple, but seemed to be constantly aware of their presence. Her earlier confidence had completely eroded, replaced by nervous energy that Anna, standing nearby, couldn't ignore. Anna finally approached Carol, her voice low and hesitant. Do you think they really had something to do with it?" she asked, motioning subtly toward James and Marcia. Carol's head snapped toward Anna, her expression sharp. "I don't know," she said tersely, "but they've been acting suspicious since they got here." Anna frowned. "Suspicious? They've barely moved." Carol leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's the thing, Anna. Who just sits there like that, calm as can be when the police are swarming the place? Normal people would be nervous. They'd be asking questions, but not them." She shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "There's something off about them." Anna wanted to argue, but stopped herself. Something about Carol's tone unsettled her. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind told her that Carol's fear wasn't about the murder itself. It was about something else entirely. Meanwhile, Officer Ramirez returned to the lobby, his expression unreadable as he approached the head of security. Their conversation was brief but intense, with Ramirez gesturing toward the elevators and the security chief nodding solemnly. Moments later, the head of security disappeared into the back office, presumably to retrieve the camera footage. James watched all of this unfold with quiet interest, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "They're piecing it together," he murmured to Marcia. She nodded, her gaze fixed on Carol. "She's unraveling faster than I thought. Look at her. She's terrified." At that moment, Carol abruptly left the reception desk, her hurried steps echoing across the marble floor as she headed toward the staff-only area. James and Marcia exchanged a look, their suspicions deepening. A few minutes later, Officer Ramirez approached the couple again, his notepad in hand. "Mr. Williamson, Mrs. Williamson," he began, his tone still professional but more pointed this time. "I understand you've been sitting here most of the evening. Did you notice anyone acting strangely before or after Mr. Donovan went upstairs?" James leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "If you're asking whether we saw anyone follow him, no, we didn't," he said. "But strange behavior, that's been on display all night." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Can you elaborate?" Marcia spoke this time, her tone measured. "The staff, officer. There's been a lot of tension, whispering, nervous glances. It started long before you arrived." Ramirez's pen paused on his notepad. "Anyone in particular?" Marcia didn't hesitate. "Carol, the woman at the reception desk. She's been avoiding us all evening. And now, she looks like she's ready to bolt." Ramirez's gaze shifted toward the staff-only door where Carol had disappeared moments earlier. He nodded slowly, as though filing the information away. "Thank you," he said. "We'll look into it." As Ramirez walked away, Marcia leaned toward James. "Do you think she's involved?" "She knows more than she's letting on," James replied. "The question is, how much?" The couple's quiet exchange was interrupted by a sudden commotion. A staff member burst out of the staff-only area, her face pale and her hands shaking. "It's gone!" she cried, her voice shrill. "The footage! Someone erased the footage!" Gasps rippled through the lobby as everyone froze, the gravity of her words sinking in. Officer Ramirez rushed toward the staff member, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "What do you mean, erased?" he demanded. "The security footage," the staff member stammered. "From tonight. It's gone. Someone must have deleted it." James and Marcia exchanged another look, their suspicions now confirmed. Whatever had happened to Donovan, it wasn't just a random act of violence. There were deeper secrets buried within the walls of the Grand Royal Hotel, and the cracks were beginning to show. The revelation of the erased footage sent shockwaves through the lobby. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, their voices a mix of fear and curiosity. Staff members exchanged worried glances, some whispering nervously to one another. Officer Ramirez's expression hardened as he turned back to the head of security, his voice low but sharp. "Who has access to the system?" he demanded. "Just me and a few others," the security chief replied, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "But it's password protected. No one could have accessed it without my credentials." "Then we have a problem," Ramirez said, his tone clipped. "Either your system isn't as secure as you think, or someone very close to you is involved." Carol reappeared from the staff area, her movements hurried and disjointed. She approached Ramirez, her face pale but her jaw set as if she were forcing herself to maintain control. "Officer," she said, her voice shaky, "I don't know how this could have happened. Our security protocols are usually airtight. Ramirez eyed her carefully. "And where were you when this footage went missing?" Carol's eyes widened and she stammered, I was here, at the desk. I only stepped away for a moment." Ramirez didn't respond immediately. Instead, he jotted something in his notepad, his expression unreadable. He motioned for a junior officer to escort Carol aside. "We'll need a full statement," he said curtly. From their seat in the corner, James and Marcia watched the scene unfold. Marcia leaned closer to James, her voice low. "She's cornered now," she said. "Not just her," James replied, his eyes scanning the room. "Someone erased that footage for a reason, and it wasn't just to cover up Donovan's murder. There's more going on here." Their conversation was interrupted by Anna, who approached them hesitantly, her face pale but her resolve clear. "I don't know who else to talk to," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I think Carol knows more than she's saying. And she's not the only one." Marcia tilted her head, her expression softening. "What do you mean, Anna?" Anna glanced around nervously before lowering her voice further. "Donovan wasn't just a guest. He had some kind of deal with the hotel, something about money. Carol's been acting strange for weeks, and I overheard her arguing with him earlier tonight." James straightened in his chair, his interest piqued. "What kind of deal?" "I don't know the details," Anna admitted, "but it sounded bad. Something about missing funds and keeping things quiet. Donovan was threatening to go public if Carol didn't fix it." Marcia's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now he's dead." Anna nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm scared," she whispered. "If they find out I've told you this—" "They won't," James interrupted, his tone firm but reassuring. "You've done the right thing. Now let us handle the rest." Anna hesitated but finally nodded, retreating to a corner of the lobby where she could remain out of sight. Meanwhile, Ramirez had begun questioning other staff members, his voice carrying through the tense silence. Each answer seemed to raise more questions than it resolved, the web of secrets and lies growing more tangled by the moment. "Missing funds," Marcia said quietly, her mind racing. "It's not just about Donovan's murder. This whole hotel is hiding something." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Ramirez. "And the cracks are starting to show," he said. "Let's see how much longer it takes before it all comes crashing down." As if on cue, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the elevators. Heads turned as one of the junior officers emerged, holding a blood-stained envelope in his gloved hands. "Sir," he called to Ramirez, "we found this in the service elevator shaft." The room fell silent as Ramirez took the envelope, carefully opening it to reveal a series of documents. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression darkening with every line he read. "It's financial records," he announced, his voice grim. "Large sums of money, misdirected, laundered, and signed off by Donovan and Carol." Gasps rippled through the lobby as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. But for James and Marcia, this was only the beginning. "They've been playing a dangerous game," Marcia said softly, her eyes narrowing. "And someone just decided to end it." James nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Now we just have to wait for them to make their next move." The air grew heavier, the weight of the revelations hanging over everyone in the room. The truth was beginning to surface, but it was clear that the real danger was far from over. The lobby grew eerily silent after Officer Ramirez's revelation. The financial records found in the elevator shaft had thrown the entire investigation into a new light. Staff members exchanged panicked glances, while guests whispered among themselves, their fear mingled with curiosity. Carol, standing off to the side with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, looked like she might collapse. "Financial records?" Someone from the staff murmured, loud enough for others to hear. "What does that have to do with Mr. Donovan's murder?" Ramirez ignored the growing murmurs as he focused on the papers in his hand. His jaw tightened as he flipped through the documents, his sharp eyes scanning the names and numbers that told a story of deceit and greed. He turned to the head of security. "We need a list of every staff member who had direct access to these accounts," he said firmly. "Now." The security chief nodded, hurrying toward his office, but his pale face betrayed his own rise in fear. From their corner, James and Marcia watched with quiet intensity. James leaned slightly toward Marcia, his voice low and deliberate. "They've dug themselves into a deep hole," he said. Marcia nodded, her gaze fixed on Carol, who now looked like a cornered animal. "And they're getting desperate. That's when mistakes happen." As if on cue, Carol abruptly stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "I want to make something clear," she said, her words cutting through the whispers in the room. "I don't know how those documents ended up there, but this has nothing to do with me." Ramirez turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You were just named in these financial records along with Mr. Donovan," he said evenly. "And you're telling me you don't know anything about them?" Carol hesitated, the color draining from her face. I signed off on some things, yes," she admitted, her voice faltering. "But I didn't know it was illegal. Donovan handled all of that. He made it clear that I didn't have a choice." Ramirez raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Didn't have a choice?" Carol nodded frantically, her desperation spilling over. "He threatened me. He said if I didn't go along with it, he'd ruin my career." Her voice cracked as she added, "I didn't kill him, I swear." James exchanged a glance with Marcia, both of them silently processing her words. Marcia leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's not lying about being pressured," she said. "But there's more she's not saying." James nodded. "And she's trying to shift the blame. That won't hold for long." Ramirez studied Carol for a moment before motioning for another officer to escort her to the side. "We'll take a full statement from you," he said, "but I'll warn you. If you're withholding anything, it's going to come out sooner rather than later." Carol's shoulders sagged as she was led away, her earlier defiance crumbling under the weight of the situation. Meanwhile, Anna had been watching the entire exchange from a distance. She hesitated for a moment before approaching James and Marcia again. Her hands clenched nervously. "It's worse than I thought," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know about the money, but if Carol's involved, she's not the only one." Marcia turned to her, her expression softening. "What do you mean, Anna?" Anna glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "There are others," she said, her voice barely audible. "Staff members who've been acting strange for months. Secret meetings, whispered conversations. I didn't know what it was about, but now it makes sense." "Who else?" James asked, his tone calm but firm. Anna hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm not sure, but I know Carol isn't the only one who had access to those accounts." Marcia exchanged a glance with James, her mind racing. "It's a network," she said softly. "Donovan might have been at the center of it, but he wasn't working alone." Before James could respond, the doors to the lobby swung open, and another officer entered, his expression grim. He whispered something to Ramirez, who immediately called for everyone's attention. "We have new information," Ramirez announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. It appears that Mr. Donovan wasn't just involved in financial fraud. He was blackmailing several individuals, including members of this hotel's staff. Gasps rippled through the room as the weight of his words sank in. Ramirez's gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on several staff members whose faces paled visibly. James leaned back slightly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "The web is starting to unravel," he murmured to Marcia. "And it's about to collapse," she replied. As the officers began questioning staff members with renewed intensity, the atmosphere in the lobby grew heavier. Secrets were coming to light, and with every revelation it became clearer that the truth behind Donovan's murder was more twisted than anyone had imagined. The revelation of Donovan's blackmail sent shockwaves through the room. The staff's uneasy whispers became louder, the tension bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Guests huddled in corners, some demanding to leave the hotel, while others stayed, captivated by the unraveling drama. The police presence became even more pronounced, officers moving between the staff like shadows, their questions sharp and unrelenting. Carol sat in a corner of the lobby, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. Her earlier outburst had drawn more attention than she intended, and now she looked like a woman teetering on the edge. Anna watched her from a distance, torn between sympathy and fear. She had known Carol as strict and occasionally harsh, but never this unhinged. Officer Ramirez remained at the center of it all, his calm exterior masking the growing urgency of the investigation. He pulled aside the security chief, his voice low but commanding. "We need a list of every staff member Donovan interacted with in the last 48 hours. Prioritize those who could have known about the blackmail." The security chief nodded but hesitated. "I'll get it for you," he said, his voice shaky. "But this is bigger than I thought." "It always is," Ramirez replied grimly. James and Marcia continued to observe, their expressions unreadable. They exchanged occasional whispers, their words drowned out by the noise around them. Marcia finally leaned in, her voice just loud enough for James to hear. "Donovan's blackmail wasn't just financial," she said. "There's something more personal here. You can feel it." James nodded. "People don't erase security footage to protect fraud alone," he said. "Whoever did it was hiding something bigger, and they were desperate enough to kill for it." Anna approached them again, her steps hesitant but determined. She clutched a tray of water glasses, an excuse to move closer without drawing suspicion. "There's something else," she said softly, placing the tray on the table. Her voice shook, but her words came quickly, as if she was afraid she might lose her nerve. "I heard Carol talking to someone earlier today. A man. She called him sir, but I didn't see who it was." Marcia tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Do you remember what they said?" Anna nodded. "Not everything, but it sounded like an argument. She kept saying she didn't want to do it, but the man told her she didn't have a choice. And then," she swallowed hard, "she said something about a meeting in Donovan's suite." James's expression darkened. "What time was this?" "Right before the evening shift started," Anna replied. "Around 6, maybe earlier." Marcia exchanged a sharp glance with James. "That would have been just before Donovan went upstairs," she said. "Exactly," Anna whispered. "I don't know what they were meeting about, but Carol was terrified." James's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, his gaze landing on Carol. "She wasn't working alone," he said. "There's someone else pulling the strings." Anna nodded, then hesitated. "Be careful," she said softly. "Whoever's behind this, they're dangerous." Meanwhile, Ramirez had shifted his focus to the blackmail evidence. He stood in the middle of the lobby, holding up one of the documents recovered from the blood-stained envelope. "These records point to multiple victims," he announced, his voice loud and clear. "Not just financial fraud. Donovan was collecting secrets, personal, damaging secrets, and using them to manipulate people." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Some of the staff visibly recoiled, their expressions ranging from fear to outright panic. One young waiter dropped the tray he was holding, the crash echoing through the tense silence. Ramirez continued, his gaze sharp. "The question isn't just who killed Donovan, but who had the most to lose if their secret came out." James leaned toward Marcia, his voice low. "He's narrowing it down." Marcia nodded. "But the real culprit won't go down without a fight." As Ramirez directed his officers to collect more statements, the sense of urgency in the room grew. The staff's carefully constructed facade of professionalism had crumbled, replaced by fear and desperation. All eyes were on the police now, but James and Marcia could see the cracks forming in the shadows. "We're close," Marcia said quietly. "Whoever did this, they're going to slip." James's lips curved into a faint smile. "And when they do, we'll be ready." In the distance, Carol's phone buzzed on the desk, the screen lighting up with a message. She snatched it up quickly, her face a mask of panic as she read the text. Whatever it said, it made her stand abruptly and head toward the back office. Marcia's eyes narrowed. "There it is," she murmured. "She's about to make her move." James stood, his posture calm but commanding. "Let's see where this takes us." As the couple quietly followed Carol's hurried steps, the room behind them buzzed with growing chaos. The threads were unraveling faster now, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down. Carol darted into the staff-only corridor, her hurried steps echoing against the tiled floor. Her phone remained clenched tightly in her hand, her fingers trembling as she typed a reply to the message she had just received. The text read, "I can't do this anymore. They're closing in. What do you want me to do?" Asterisk, asterisk. James and Marcia followed quietly, their footsteps light but purposeful. They kept enough distance to avoid detection, yet close enough to see Carol disappear into a small office at the end of the hall. The door closed with a muffled thud, but not before they caught a glimpse of her frantic pacing inside. "She's unraveling," Marcia whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded. "And she's about to make a mistake." They moved closer, pausing near the door. From inside, Carol's muffled voice could be heard as she spoke urgently into her phone. "I told you it's over. The police are here, and they know about the blackmail. I can't cover for you anymore." There was a long pause, followed by Carol's voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "No, I don't care what you promised. You said this would be easy. Now Donovan is dead, and they're looking at me." James exchanged a glance with Marcia, their suspicions confirmed. Carol wasn't just complicit, she was being controlled. And whoever was on the other end of that call was likely the real orchestrator behind everything. Inside the office, Carol's voice rose again, this time tinged with panic. "If I go down for this, so do you. Don't forget, I have copies of everything. I'll—" She stopped abruptly, her words cut off by a chilling silence. James moved closer to the door, pressing his ear against it. "She's panicking," he said softly. "Panicked people are dangerous," Marcia replied, her eyes scanning the corridor. "We need to be careful." Suddenly, the sound of a drawer slamming came from inside the office, followed by hurried movements. Carol was preparing to leave, but not before gathering something, evidence perhaps, or a final safeguard against whoever had dragged her into this mess. The door burst open, and Carol stepped out, clutching a file folder tightly against her chest. She froze when she saw James and Marcia standing there, her face draining of color. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling but laced with defiance. James smiled faintly, his tone calm. "We could ask you the same thing." Carol's grip on the folder tightened, and she took a step back, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Stay out of this," she hissed. "You have no idea what's going on." "Actually, we have a pretty good idea," Marcia said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but carried a quiet authority. "You're in over your head, Carol. Whatever you're holding on to in that folder, it's not going to save you." Carol shook her head, her breath coming in short gasps. "You don't understand. I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't." "Then why are you running?" James asked, his gaze steady. Carol faltered, her defenses crumbling under the weight of their calm interrogation. Because I know who did," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Then tell us, who are you protecting?" Before Carol could answer, a shadow appeared at the end of the corridor. It was one of the hotel's senior managers, a man named Victor, who had been conspicuously absent during most of the investigation. He walked toward them, slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his expression unreadable. "Carol," he said smoothly, his voice calm but chilling, "I think it's time you stopped talking." Carol froze, her face going pale. "Victor, I—" Victor raised a hand, silencing her. His gaze shifted to James and Marcia, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And you too," he said, his tone sharpening. "Guests should stay in the lobby. This is none of your concern." James crossed his arms, his calm demeanor unwavering. "That's an interesting thing to say, Victor," he replied, "considering you've been conveniently missing all evening." Victor's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I've been handling operations," he said smoothly, "trying to keep this situation under control." "Or cleaning up loose ends?" Marcia asked pointedly. Victor's expression darkened, and for a moment, a flicker of anger crossed his face. But before he could respond, Carol spoke up, her voice trembling. "They know, Victor. They found the documents. It's over." Victor turned to her, his expression shifting into something cold and dangerous. "Not if you keep your mouth shut," he said quietly. James stepped forward, placing himself between Victor and Carol. "You're not scaring anyone, Victor," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever you're hiding, it's only a matter of time before the police find out." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the corridor was filled with a tense, heavy silence. Then, without warning, Victor turned and walked away, his steps measured but quick. "We need to move," James said, turning to Marcia. Marcia nodded, her eyes on Carol. "And she's coming with us," she said. Carol hesitated, clutching the folder tightly. I don't know." "You don't have a choice," James said, his voice calm but commanding. "If you stay here, Victor will make sure you don't get another chance to talk." After a long moment, Carol nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered, "but you have to protect me." "We will," Marcia said firmly. "But first, you're going to tell us everything." As they moved quickly down the corridor, the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. But with Victor now aware of their movements, the danger had only just begun. Hash, hash, Section 11, Revelations and Betrayals. James, Marcia, and Carol slipped into a smaller conference room just off the corridor. The tension was palpable, with Carol clutching the folder to her chest like a lifeline. She glanced nervously at the door, as if expecting Victor to burst through at any moment. James locked the door and turned to face her. His calm demeanor seemed to unnerve Carol even more. "Now," he said, his voice steady but firm, "tell us everything." Carol hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She placed the folder on the table but didn't open it. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said, her voice trembling. "If I tell you what I know, they'll come after me." "They already are," Marcia said sharply, crossing her arms. "And if you think Victor's going to protect you, you're fooling yourself. He's cleaning up loose ends, Carol. You're next." Carol's eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't want any of this," she sobbed. "I just wanted to keep my job." James pulled a chair across from her and sat down, his voice softening. "We understand that you were pressured, but you need to tell us what you know. Who's behind this? Who killed Donovan?" Carol took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped her face. Slowly, she opened the folder, revealing a collection of papers, emails, and photographs. She pushed them toward James and Marcia. "It's all in here," she said quietly. Marcia picked up one of the papers, her eyes scanning the text. It was a printout of an email exchange between Donovan and Victor, discussing large sums of money being funneled through fake accounts. Another document detailed a blackmail scheme involving several high-profile guests. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcia said, her voice low. Carol nodded. Donovan and Victor were running the scheme together. They used the hotel as a front for everything: fraud, blackmail, even laundering money. But Donovan got greedy. He started threatening Victor, saying he'd go public unless Victor gave him a bigger cut. James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. And Victor couldn't afford to let that happen. Carol swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she picked up another document. "I overheard them arguing earlier today," she said. "Donovan told Victor he had proof that could take him down. That's when Victor snapped. He said he'd make sure Donovan wouldn't live to see the morning." Marcia's eyes narrowed. "So Victor killed Donovan?" Carol hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. I thought he was bluffing, but after what happened tonight—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears again. James glanced at the door, his mind racing. "If Victor knows you have these documents, he won't stop until he gets them back," he said. Carol nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's dangerous. You don't understand how far he'll go to protect himself." Marcia stood, her expression determined. "Then we need to take this to Ramirez, now." Carol froze, her panic returning. "No. If the police get involved, Victor will find out I gave this to you. He'll come after me." "He's already coming after you," James said firmly. "But if you keep running, you're just making it easier for him. The only way to protect yourself is to expose him." Carol hesitated, fear and desperation warring on her face. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," she whispered, "but you have to promise you'll keep me safe." "We will," Marcia said, her voice steady. As they prepared to leave the room, James paused, his eyes narrowing. "Wait," he said, holding up a hand. From the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps echoed closer. Marcia moved quickly to turn off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. Carol stifled a gasp, clutching the folder tightly as the footsteps grew louder. A shadow passed by the frosted glass of the conference room door, lingering for a moment before moving on. James stood perfectly still, his body tense. "Victor?" Marcia mouthed, her eyes sharp. James nodded. "He knows," he whispered. The danger was no longer hypothetical. Victor wasn't just a shadow in the background. He was hunting them now. "We have to move," Marcia said, her voice low but urgent, "before he gets ahead of us." James turned to Carol, his expression serious. "Stay close," he said. "We're not letting him win." With the folder in hand and the stakes higher than ever, they slipped out of the room, their every step marked by the shadow of danger. The trio moved swiftly through the dimly lit hallway, their steps quiet but deliberate. James led the way, his eyes scanning for any signs of Victor. Marcia stayed close behind, one hand on Carol's arm to steady her as she clutched the incriminating folder like a lifeline. The tension in the air was suffocating, every sound amplified by their heightened awareness. "Where are we going?" Carol whispered, her voice trembling. "To Ramirez," James replied curtly. "He's the only one who can stop this now." They reached the end of the hallway and paused, listening for any movement. The distant hum of the lobby filled the silence, but closer by the faint creak of footsteps on the other side of a corner set their nerves on edge. James held up a hand, signaling them to stay still. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Marcia's grip on Carol tightened as they pressed against the wall. A shadow appeared, stretching across the floor as someone approached the corner. James took a deep breath, his body tensing as the figure stepped into view. It wasn't Victor. It was Anna, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing here?" Marcia whispered, stepping forward to pull Anna into their hiding spot. Anna glanced over her shoulder, her breath coming in short gasps. "I saw Victor heading toward the back stairs," she said, her voice barely audible. "He looked furious. I think he knows you're trying to reach the police." James nodded, his mind racing. "Then we need to move faster." Anna hesitated, then whispered, "I can help. There's a service corridor that leads to the security office. It's faster and less obvious than going through the lobby." James considered her offer for a moment, then nodded. "Show us the way." Anna led them through a narrow, dimly lit corridor, the walls lined with cleaning supplies and storage lockers. The air was heavy with the faint scent of disinfectant, and the hum of machinery filled the space. "Stay close," Anna whispered, glancing back at them. "This corridor connects to the main stairwell. From there, we can get to the security office where Ramirez is." As they moved deeper into the corridor, Carol's breathing grew heavier. She clutched the folder tighter, her knuckles white. "I don't think I can do this," she murmured, her voice shaking. "You don't have a choice," Marcia said firmly. "If we stop now, Victor wins, and you know what that means." Carol nodded reluctantly, her steps faltering but steadying as they continued. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind them. The sound reverberated through the narrow corridor, making everyone freeze. "He's here!" Anna whispered, her voice trembling. James turned, his eyes narrowing. "Keep moving," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "We're almost there." They quickened their pace, the tension in the air growing heavier with every step. A sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. As they reached the end of the corridor, Anna pointed to a metal door. "That's the stairwell," she said. "It'll take us straight to Ramirez." James pushed the door open carefully, peering inside. The stairwell was empty, the concrete walls amplifying the sound of their breathing. "Go," he said, motioning for the others to enter. They hurried up the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Carol stumbled, but Marcia caught her, pulling her upright. "Keep moving," she urged. Behind them, the stairwell door creaked open. James glanced back, his jaw tightening as he caught a glimpse of Victor stepping inside. His face was cold, his movements methodical as he began to climb the stairs after them. "He's coming," James said, his voice low but steady. Marcia quickened her pace, practically dragging Carol along. Anna led the way, her steps frantic as they approached the next landing. As they burst through the door onto the next floor, they found themselves in another narrow hallway. Anna motioned to a door at the end. "That's the security office," she said. But as they rushed toward the door, Victor's voice echoed from behind them, cold and calculating. "You're only making this harder on yourselves," he called out. "Give me the folder and I'll let you walk away. Keep running, and I can't guarantee your safety." Carol whimpered, her grip on the folder tightening. "He's lying," Marcia said firmly. "Don't stop." They reached the door and Anna pounded on it frantically. "Officer Ramirez," she shouted. "It's us. Open the door." For a moment, there was no response. The sound of Victor's footsteps grew louder, closer. Then the door opened, and Ramirez stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What's going on?" he demanded. James stepped inside, pulling Marcia and Carol with him. "Victor's behind all of it," he said quickly. "Donovan, the blackmail, the money, it's all him. And now he's coming for us." Ramirez's eyes widened as he processed their words. "Get inside," he said, pulling the door shut behind them. He locked it just as Victor reached the hallway, his shadow stretching across the floor. Inside the office, Ramirez turned to James and Marcia. "Start talking," he said, his voice sharp, "and don't leave anything out." As the sound of Victor pounding on the door echoed through the room, James took a deep breath, ready to reveal the truth. But he knew that the real fight was just beginning. The pounding on the door grew louder, each thud echoing in the cramped security office. Carol flinched with every hit, her hands trembling as she clutched the incriminating folder. Ramirez quickly moved to secure the door further, sliding a heavy filing cabinet in front of it. "Start talking," Ramirez ordered, turning back to James and Marcia, his expression tense. "What exactly is going on, and why is Victor trying to get to you?" James stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. Victor and Donovan were running a scheme through this hotel. Money laundering, blackmail, fraud, you name it. Donovan got greedy and started threatening Victor, demanding a larger cut or he'd go public. That's why Donovan was killed. Ramirez's brow furrowed, his sharp eyes narrowing. "And you have proof of this?" Marcia gestured toward Carol, who slowly placed the folder on the desk. "It's all in there," Marcia said. "Emails, financial records, blackmail schemes. It connects them both." Ramirez opened the folder and began scanning the documents. His face grew darker with every page he flipped. This is enough to bring down an entire network," he muttered, his voice low. He turned to Carol. "How did you get this?" Carol hesitated, her voice shaky. "I was involved, not by choice," she added quickly, her eyes darting toward Marcia for reassurance. "Victor forced me. He said if I didn't help cover things up, he'd destroy my career. And worse." Ramirez nodded grimly, clearly piecing the story together. "And Donovan? When did you last see him?" "I overheard them arguing earlier tonight," Carol admitted, her voice trembling. "Victor told Donovan he'd make sure he wouldn't be a problem anymore. I thought it was just a threat, but then Then Donovan was killed. As Ramirez continued to study the folder, the pounding on the door stopped. A chilling silence settled over the room, making everyone freeze. "He's not gone," James said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. Ramirez nodded, motioning for everyone to stay quiet. He pulled his radio from his belt and whispered into it, calling for backup. "We have a suspect on site, armed and dangerous. Victor, senior manager of the Grand Royal Hotel. Send units to the security office immediately." Suddenly, a loud crash came from outside as Victor began slamming something heavy against the door. Ramirez pulled his gun, his body tense. "Stay back," he ordered. Inside the office, Marcia whispered to James, "He's desperate. He knows the walls are closing in." James nodded. "And that makes him even more dangerous." The door frame began to splinter under the force of Victor's attacks. Carol whimpered, shrinking back into the corner while Anna clutched her hands tightly, her eyes darting between Ramirez and the door. Then, with one final crash, the door burst open and Victor stormed in, a gun in his hand and rage etched across his face. "Nobody move," he barked, his voice filled with venom. Ramirez immediately aimed his weapon at Victor, his stance steady. "Put the gun down, Victor. It's over." Victor sneered, his eyes darting between Ramirez and the others. "Over? You have no idea how deep this goes. Donovan was a liability. I did what I had to do." "You killed him," James said, stepping forward slightly. His voice was calm but laced with steel. "And now you're trying to cover your tracks." Victor's hand shook slightly, but he tightened his grip on the gun. "You don't know anything," he snapped. "You don't know what it's like to have everything to lose." "You've already lost," Marcia said, her voice steady, "and you know it. That's why you're here, threatening all of us. But it's too late, Victor. The evidence is in Ramirez's hands, and backup is on the way." Victor's eyes flickered with panic as he realized the truth. The folder on the desk, the radio still crackling faintly in Ramirez's hand. It was over. But desperation had taken hold, and he wasn't thinking clearly. "Stay back!" Victor shouted, waving the gun erratically. Ramirez took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Victor, put the weapon down. You can still walk out of this alive." For a moment, it seemed like Victor might listen. His hand wavered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But then his gaze landed on Carol, and his expression twisted into fury. "You," he snarled, "you betrayed me." Victor raised the gun toward Carol, but before he could fire, Ramirez acted. A single gunshot echoed through the room, and Victor collapsed to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The gun slid from his hand, spinning across the floor as blood pooled beneath him. The room fell silent, except for Victor's labored breathing. Ramirez quickly secured the weapon and called for medics through his radio. James stepped forward, his gaze steady as he looked down at Victor. "It's over," he said quietly. Victor groaned, his face contorted in pain. "You don't know what you've started," he hissed. Marcia raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Victor didn't answer, his head falling back as his eyes fluttered closed. Ramirez gestured for everyone to stay back as he checked Victor's pulse. "He's alive," he said, "but barely." The sound of sirens filled the air as backup finally arrived. Officers stormed into the room, quickly taking control of the situation. Victor was handcuffed and taken out on a stretcher, his threats lingering in the air like a dark cloud. As the chaos began to subside, Ramirez turned to James and Marcia. "This isn't over," he said, his voice serious. "Victor's right. There's more to this, and we're only scratching the surface. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We've got the evidence. Now, it's time to bring the whole house down." Marcia placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady. "And we will. But this is only the beginning." As the officers began to clear the room, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. The truth was out, but the battle was far from over. The once bustling lobby of the Grand Royal Hotel was now a crime scene. Police officers cordoned off sections, interviewed staff and guests, and meticulously gathered evidence. Victor's stretcher was wheeled out through a side entrance, his limp body a grim reminder of how far desperation could drive someone. James, Marcia, and Carol sat in a quiet corner of the lobby under Ramirez's watchful eye. Carol looked exhausted, her face pale and her hands trembling as she held a glass of water. Anna hovered nearby, her expression a mix of fear and relief. "You did the right thing," Marcia told Carol gently. Carol nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I thought if I kept quiet, it would all go away." James leaned forward, his tone firm but kind. "Secrets never stay buried, Carol. And people like Victor, they'll always take more until there's nothing left." Ramirez approached, his notepad in hand and a tired look on his face. "Victor's been taken into custody. He's stable, but it'll be a while before he's ready to talk. In the meantime, this folder," he said, lifting the evidence Carol had given him, "is enough to start a full investigation. You've blown the lid off something much bigger than this hotel." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "How big are we talking?" Ramirez hesitated, then sighed. "The blackmail victims include politicians, corporate executives, and high-profile public figures. Donovan and Victor were running an empire of corruption, and this hotel was just one piece of it. With the right moves, we can bring down the entire network." James nodded. "Then you'd better move fast. If Victor had accomplices, they'll try to cover their tracks now that the operation is exposed." "Already on it," Ramirez replied. "We've frozen the hotel's financial accounts and flagged everyone connected to Donovan and Victor for questioning. But this is going to take time." Carol looked up, fear flickering in her eyes. "What about me?" she asked. "I helped them. I signed documents. Am I going to jail?" Ramirez studied her for a moment before answering. "You're not off the hook," he said honestly. "But the fact that you came forward, gave us evidence, and risked your life to do the right thing will work in your favor. The DA will take that into account." Carol nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. I want to make it right." "You've taken the first step," Marcia said gently. "Now keep going." Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, James and Marcia stood outside the hotel. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. Exhausted but resolute, they watched as police cars and forensic vans cleared out, leaving behind a silent, eerie calm. "Do you think this is really over?" Marcia asked, her voice thoughtful. "Not yet," James replied, his gaze steady. "But we've started something that can't be stopped. Victor's network is going to collapse, and when it does, a lot of people are going to fall with it." Marcia nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "You always did like shaking things up." James chuckled softly. "Someone has to." As they turned to leave, Anna approached them, her steps hesitant but determined. "Wait," she called out. I wanted to thank you." Marcia smiled warmly. "You were braver than you realize, Anna. Standing up, speaking out, that's not easy. You should be proud of yourself." Anna blushed, ducking her head. "I just did what I thought was right." "And that," James said, makes all the difference." Anna hesitated, then added, "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." "We'll keep that in mind," Marcia said, giving her a reassuring nod. As Anna walked back into the hotel, James and Marcia headed toward their car. The city was waking up, the early morning traffic a reminder that life would move forward, even after a night like this. James opened the car door for Marcia, then paused, looking back at the towering facade of the Grand Royal Hotel. "Do you think they'll fix this place?" he asked. Marcia shrugged. "It depends on what the truth does to it. Sometimes things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt." James nodded thoughtfully, then slid into the driver's seat. As they drove off, leaving the chaos behind, one thing was clear. They had not only uncovered the truth, but had also started a chain reaction that would bring justice to light, no matter how many shadows tried to hide it. And, in the quiet of the morning, they knew that their work, though far from finished, had made a difference.